In this video, I'll be sharing with you guys my updated 2026 Senate map prediction. We've seen a ton of changes over the last few months, with new candidates entering the races and other incumbents choosing not to run for re-election and instead retire. Looking at the map of incumbents, we see that there are now 7 incumbent senators that are choosing not to run in 2026. 4 of them Democrats, 3 of them Republicans. The big one is, of course, Thom Tillis from North Carolina. He narrowly won in 2020 and has chosen not to seek a third term in 2026. And in all likelihood, this is very good news for Republicans because now they'll be able to put up a much stronger candidate. And just to provide a little bit of context, going into these midterms, the GOP is sitting on a 53-seat majority, Democrats at 47, after they lost West Virginia, Ohio, Montana, and Pennsylvania back in 2024. They even almost lost in Wisconsin and Michigan, 2 states Republicans had basically no chance of winning. If you looked at the betting markets, and even if you looked at the polls, the GOP was behind by 5-10 points in both of these races, but ultimately the 2 candidates, Mike Rogers and Eric Hovde, massively overperformed. And in 2026, we have another Senate race in Michigan, which Republicans can potentially take. And so coming back to the map, we'll start by filling in the solid states for both the Democrats and the Republicans. These are the races that they'll win by margins of 15 percentage points or more. These are the least competitive states on the map. And so we'll begin with the solid red states. We have Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and South Carolina, giving the GOP 45 seats, just 5 away from the 50 that they need to retain control. Meanwhile, for the Democrats, I can only give them Oregon, along with Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware. This puts them at 39. So with just these solid states filled in, Republicans already take a 6-seat lead. And so this is a very favorable map for Republicans. There are only 2 states where they're even remotely vulnerable, which we will talk about more in depth later on. But North Carolina is one of them, where, of course, Thom Tillis is retiring. So we have good news there for the GOP. And the other state is Maine. This is the only seat held by a Republican in a state that was won by Kamala Harris in 2024. And so Maine's seat is going to be very competitive. But Susan Collins has showed us in the past that she can win even when everybody expects her to lose. That's exactly what happened 5 years ago. And beyond this, Democrats don't really have any chance of flipping any other seats. They're not going to win in Texas, and they're not going to win in Florida. And so this means that with Republicans coming into the midterms with 53 seats, they can lose both North Carolina and Maine and still have a clear majority. And so we're now going to move on to filling in the likely states. These races are going to be a bit more competitive. They'll be decided by margins of 5 to 15 points. In these races, one party or one candidate has a clear edge, but it is going to get a little bit more attention. And the first race I want to talk about is Nebraska, where Dan Osborne has recently announced his candidacy to run against the incumbent Republican, Pete Ricketts. Now, Pete Ricketts was appointed in 2023 to replace Ben Sasse. He hasn't officially won the Republican nomination yet, but he will, by all accounts, become the nominee. So he'll be running for his first full 6-year term. Now, Dan Osborne is an independent, and he is likely to win the support and the endorsement of the Democratic Party in Nebraska, because in 2024, Dan Osborne was endorsed by the Democrats, and he ran against Republican incumbent Deb Fischer. Fischer won the race by less than 7 points. This is a pretty abysmal margin for Republicans in Nebraska, and so Dan Osborne will pose a relatively strong challenge to Pete Ricketts next November, but 2026 is a midterm year. Dan Osborne is likely to gain more momentum in a big election year like 2024. I expect him to do better than any Democrat could. However, I don't expect him to win. Nebraska will be in the likely GOP category. Next up in Iowa, we still don't know whether or not Republican incumbent Joni Ernst will be running for a third term. She isn't very popular with Trump's base. If the president decides to endorse a different candidate in the primary, they would almost certainly beat her. But no matter who it is that the GOP nominates here in Iowa, Democrats are not going to flip this seat. It is going to be a Republican that comes out on top. The state is simply too conservative at this point. Iowa is also going to be likely red. Next up, we have Jon Husted running for his first full term in Ohio. He came into office in January when J.D. Vance became the vice president. He was appointed by Governor Mike DeWine. He is going to be nominated by the Republican Party, and on the Democratic side, there's really nobody that can challenge him. Even Sherrod Brown, the former U.S. Senator that lost re-election in 2024, he is not going to defeat Jon Husted here, and nor is Tim Ryan, who chose not to run for this seat already. And really, Tim Ryan and Sherrod Brown were the only hope Democrats had. Without either of them in the race, Jon Husted is going to easily win his first full term in the upper chamber of Congress. The Buckeye State will also be likely Republican. Coming down to the South, we have John Cornyn running for re-election. He won a fourth term in 2020. Now he's running for a fifth, but he is facing a strong primary challenge from Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. Now, Ken Paxton has had marriage issues over the last few weeks that have become very public. And so we've seen another big change here where in the past it was thought that Ken Paxton would easily defeat John Cornyn in a Republican primary, but now the odds of that are significantly lower. Ken Paxton is not the best candidate for this seat. John Cornyn would perform better. New polling after the whole divorce affair will show John Cornyn in a better position, but that doesn't mean that he's in the clear. We do have other candidates that are potentially interested. One of them is Wesley Hunt, who also polls a not insignificant amount compared to Paxton and Cornyn. However, ultimately, this is Texas. This is one of the most Republican states in the country. It is going to be likely for the GOP. No Democrat is winning here. And then in Florida, there isn't really much to talk about here. Ashley Moody is going to win her first full term. Now, just like Husted, she was appointed following the resignation of Marco Rubio, who went on to become Trump's Secretary of State. And so Moody isn't facing any significant challenges from her fellow Republicans in the Sunshine State. Democrats are not going to win here. I mean, Marco Rubio won by a solid margin 4 years ago. Ashley Moody is going to win by just under 15 points. It's still going to be a pretty solid victory. And then finally in Alaska, Dan Sullivan is going to be reelected to a third term. He's been serving since 2014. We might see a Democrat, might see an independent here. It may even be Mary Peltola, the former representative who served Alaska's at-large district, but she lost her reelection in 2024. I mean, she's not invincible. She's not that popular of a candidate either. She certainly is not going to defeat the incumbent Republican Senator. Dan Sullivan is on track to winning reelection, and so the state is also going to be likely red. And so with all the likely seats, as well as the solid ones filled in for the GOP, they are already at 51 seats. There's no doubt they are going to retain control of the upper chamber. Democrats will win a few more seats, though. We do have 4 likely Democratic races, starting off with Colorado and New Mexico. Both John Hickenlooper and Ben Ray Lujan will be reelected to a second term. And then in Illinois, incumbent Democrat Dick Durbin is retiring, but he will be replaced by another member of his own party. And finally, we have Virginia, where we don't know yet whether or not Mark Warner will be running for re-election. The incumbent Democrat has already served nearly 3 full terms. However, the issue for him here is that Glenn Youngkin may actually end up running for this seat. He is the current governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He was elected back in 2021, but he is term limited, so he cannot run again, which means means that he'll have all of 2026 to campaign, and that is very bad news for the Democrats. Now, I'm not saying that Glenn Youngkin would be the favorite. However, he would have a very good chance if he ran against the incumbent Democrat. Now, if Mark Warner doesn't choose to run at all, that's even better news for Republicans, but so far, Mark Warner hasn't dropped out yet. I think there's a pretty good chance he will stay in the race. And if he does, Democrats are slightly favored here. But without Youngkin in the race yet either, I'm going to place Virginia into the likely blue category for now. But if we do see a Youngkin entrance, the state might become lean or even tilt. And so with all the likely blue states now filled in as well, Democrats are at 43 seats. Even if they won all of the remaining 6, they'd still only be at 49, but they are not going to win all of the remaining seats here because Maine is going to go to the GOP. Susan Collins will very likely win re-election. She has chosen to run for a 6th term. That is the plan. Now, it is ironic because when Susan Collins was first elected back in 1996, she said she would only run for a 2nd term, and that would be it. But she is now on her 6th. She is, in fact, the longest-serving member of Congress from the state of Maine in history. And so Susan Collins, if she runs for a 6th time, she has a very good chance at winning her re-election, even though Maine is a state that Kamala Harris carried by around 7 points in 2024. Now, the reason why Susan Collins has such a good chance is because just look at 2020. Collins wins by 8.6%. This is against Sarah Gideon, the Democratic candidate who raised $100 million. I mean, she was really the favorite here. Her odds were at 80-90% that she was going to win. She was polling ahead of Susan Collins by around 8 to 10 points, but somehow Susan Collins came out with a majority, 51% to Sarah Gideon's 42. And so Susan Collins has proven herself in Maine, and if Democrats don't nominate a truly exceptional candidate, she will very likely win a 6th term, which means she'll be in the Senate for 36 years by the time her next term ends in 2033. And so Maine is going to be the first lean state on this map. Lean races will be decided by margins of 1 to 5%. They're going to be heavily competitive, but one party still does have a very slight edge. In neighboring New Hampshire, Jeanne Shaheen is not running for re-election. She won by 16 points back in 2020, but she will not be seeking re-election to a 4th term. And so this means that Republicans have a chance at winning this seat. She won by a solid blue margin. The race is going to become significantly more competitive now. New Hampshire has shown that it can elect Republicans. Kelly Ayotte was just elected the Republican governor back in 2024. She was also a former U.S. senator that was defeated by Maggie Hassan in 2016. And so New Hampshire can elect Republican senators, as well as, of course, governors. Chris Sununu, if he ran in this race, he's the governor that just left office a few months ago. If he ran, he would definitely have been able to win, but he chose not to seek this seat. And so we will have a new senator from New Hampshire, but at this point, we really don't know who it is going to be. But for now, it is going to be lean blue on our map. New Hampshire will definitely be a race to watch. And the final lean state on this map is going to be Minnesota, Tim Walz's state. Now, Democrats did not do well here in 2024, even though Walz was on the ballot with Kamala Harris. She only won Minnesota by 4 points, even though this is the state that holds the record for having the longest Democratic voting streak in presidential elections. And so looking at 2026, the bad news for Democrats here is that incumbent Tina Smith will not be running for re-election. This is the first U.S. Senate election in Minnesota without an incumbent since 2006. And so Republicans have a difficult choice here to make, but their best candidate is going to be Royce White, who performed okay in 2024. He lost to Amy Klobuchar by 16 points. This may seem bad, but if you look at Klobuchar's margin in 2018, she won by 24. And then back in 2012, she won by 35. So, relatively speaking, this 17-point loss is not too significant, but Royce White is going to perform significantly better if he is placed against a non-incumbent Democrat. And so Minnesota will also be relatively competitive here. It is going to be the final lean state on the map, which means with 3 seats remaining, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, it's 52 for the Republicans, 45 for the Democrats. All 3 of these races will be classified as tilt. They are the most competitive of the competitive states, and in these races, we can expect margins of less than 1%. And so starting up top in Michigan, we have a very interesting race where Gary Peters has chosen not to run for re-election. This is a big blow for the Democrats. He almost lost in 2020, so maybe his incumbency advantage wouldn't even have been that significant, but Democrats are now without a clear candidate. We do have some that have declared, but nobody that really stands out. On the Republican side, though, Mike Rogers is the clear favorite, and he should be the nominee if you're a Republican. If you want to win this seat as a member of the GOP, Mike Rogers should be your guy. He almost won in 2024, like I said at the very beginning of this video. He almost defeated Alyssa Slotkin, even though nobody thought he could win, and the national GOP barely gave him any money. Even under those circumstances, Mike Rogers came out just 0.3% behind the new Democratic senator. Now, if he runs again in 2026, he will have a very good chance at replacing Gary Peters and flipping the seat red. Michigan on my map at this point will be tilt for the Republicans. Down in the Tar Heel state, North Carolina is the most vulnerable Republican-held seat because it is held by Republican Thom Tillis, who is not popular at all. He almost lost in 2020. He basically would have lost if Cal Cunningham wasn't exposed for sexting somebody that wasn't his wife. His wife ended up divorcing him, and Cal Cunningham lost a race in which he was leading by a 10-point margin. I mean, it was a terrible month for the Democratic candidate here, but Thom Tillis somehow held on. Now, in 2026, he has chosen not to run for re-election. He wasn't going to win the nomination anyways, and Laura Trump is a potential candidate here. She is the favorite, especially if she actually chooses to run. Looking at polling, she actually defeats Thom Tillis. She's at 65%. Thom Tillis, when he was still in the race, was at 11. 25% of Republicans are undecided. Laura Trump could realistically win the seat, and Thom Tillis being gone is good news for the GOP. Now they don't have a weak candidate at the top of the ticket in North Carolina. And so just like Michigan, it is going to be tilt Republican. I do have the GOP very narrowly hanging on to the seat. And finally, in Georgia, we always have very competitive and consequential Senate races here. I mean, in 2021, the 2 runoffs gave Joe Biden and the Democrats the Senate majority. And now in 2026, Jon Ossoff will be running for re-election. Raphael Warnock won his seat in 2022. He won a full term. 2020 was only a special election for him, but Jon Ossoff is now up for election, and he probably would have lost if Brian Kemp, Georgia's governor, had chosen to run, but Brian Kemp has chosen not to enter the race, and as a result, we don't really know who the Republican candidate is going to be. Now, Jon Ossoff defeated David Perdue in the special election by just over 1%. Now, he did not win a plurality in the first round. David Perdue was 0.27% away from retaining his seat. I mean, his life would have been very different because he then went on to challenge Brian Kemp in the primary for governor in 2022 and got destroyed, even though he had Trump's endorsement. Jon Ossoff is a relatively strong candidate on the Democratic side, and I do expect him to win unless Republicans can nominate a really solid person to be at the top, but so far we don't really see that, and we don't really know who Republicans will choose here either anyways. The incumbency advantage is likely to give Democrats the seat for another 6 years. Georgia is going to be the only tilt blue state on the map. And so this is my updated 2026 Senate map prediction. Republicans at 54 seats, Democrats at 46. It's going to be a competitive cycle, but Republicans are going into it from a very firm position. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like this video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think is going to win the majority and which races you're watching specifically. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more content just like this as we head into midterm season.